Hello, everyone. I am back again to read another story. This one is titled Houses for the Dead. It's the first ghost story I've ever written, although I'm not quite sure if it's a ghost story. There are a lot of ghosts in it, but that doesn't mean that it's a ghost story necessarily. I wrote it this past summer, the summer of 2010. Hope you enjoy. Houses for the Dead. The man was at the front door again, slouching and scuffing his feet just as he had for the last 4 nights, and Timothy pulled himself from his bed on the davenport and let him in and guided him through the dining room and into his grandparents' kitchen and retrieved a plate of leftovers from the fridge and set them on the table, which was chipped along the edges, the white spotted formica peeling away like skin. The man wore a dusty suit with wide lapels, and the top 2 buttons of his shirt were unbuttoned. He wiped his face with a kerchief and coughed once to clear his throat. Timothy held up a finger to his lips to remind the man of the necessity for quiet. The man nodded his head and continued eating, his fork scraping the plate ever so gently. He ate this way each night. Timothy kept the lights extinguished, but tonight the moon was a blue ball in the window, and the man glowed so brightly that Timothy worried his grandmother would wake thinking dawn had arrived. She slept in the next room to the kitchen, and lightly. On the man's first visit, Timothy had thought him part of a dream. He'd stood silently on the porch and held his hand over his stomach. Timothy understood the gesture. His grandparents used to speak of feeding strangers in the days when everyone was poor and no one had much, but what they did have, they shared. He'd taken the man by the hand that he might also do this good thing. He worried now, though, because the man was thin and wrinkled and burned by the sun and had a crooked jaw that clicked when he ate, which he did like a great steam engine, fast, without pause, without hardly breathing. What would happen when Timothy was gone? It was only a few more days until he was picked up and taken home. Well, home in name only. His mother's new house was more like it, a plain white box with tiny rooms and leaky faucets that he'd only seen once and found ugly and regrettable. He'd been sent here so as to be away during the chaos of the move. His father was keeping the old house, and Timothy's room would still be there, but all of his things would be gone from that room and set in place in the tiny new room with a single window that overlooked a flat yard with brown grass. Who would let this sad and silent and hungry man inside? Where would he get his food? Tonight, after he'd cleaned his plate and set it on the sink, the man paused by the front door and motioned for Timothy to follow. High Street was still, bathed by the brilliant moon. Timothy had never seen the moon so close. The man reached up and smoothed his hair, and his hand came dangerously close to the visible and dark craters. Timothy's grandparents never locked their doors, and neither did their neighbors. Why didn't the man simply walk in and eat at a different house each night? He started to ask the question, but now it was the man's turn to hold his fingers to his lips, as if his own grandparents might be sleeping nearby, like he didn't want to wake anyone. The street ran straight to the hill cemetery, where Timothy could make out the curvature of the headstones, tiny humps marking the beginning of a long slope of graves. Many of his relatives, people he'd never met, were buried there, and each day his grandmother and he went for a long constitutional through the cemetery paths, and she would hold out a long, crooked, bony finger with knuckles so swollen that it took her nearly a quarter hour to soap her rings on and off, and point to each name. Although he didn't know these people, Timothy had begun to recite and memorize their names and to imagine them. Are we going down there, to the graves? My family is there. Orville and Edna and Perry and Percy and Thelma and Elmo and Corwin and Daniel and all the rest. Corwin and Daniel were the children that his grandmother lost. Corwin as a brand new baby, barely even alive, and Daniel as a young man, lost to what his grandmother called an industrial accident. She spent the most time down by their graves, making over the flowers, using scissors to trim the grass around the headstones, while Timothy pestered her with questions she never answered. The man kept walking, shuffling and kicking loose stones that had accumulated on the asphalt. Each house kept its porch light lit, but all the windows were dark. Timothy, emboldened to speak after the man didn't hold his fingers to his lips, said, "How come I never seen you before? How come you only come at night? How come you never say anything? How long did you stand there before I woke up and saw you? What would you have done if I wasn't there? How come you don't go to the other houses, or do you? Do you have lots of houses to visit? Do you eat in other houses too, or just my grandparents? Do you know my mother? She grew up here. That's her house. Those are my grandparents. I'm just visiting." The more he talked, the slower the man walked. He turned to study Timothy, and he was blurry, shot through with light. When the man opened his mouth, Timothy felt as though he were looking into a great empty pit. No sound came, and the man simply stood there waiting. Timothy watched his tongue, a tongue far too small for such a large man's mouth. There between his gapped and yellowing teeth it lay still, like an old piece of leather. "You can't talk, can you?" Timothy said. The man remained still, neither nodding nor shaking his head. "That's okay," Timothy said. "You don't have to say nothing." He was a kind man, Timothy saw, but hurt, too, or lost, or a bit of both. "Do you have family in the hill cemetery, too?" he said. The man kneeled down so that their faces were level. At first, he seemed to be trying to talk, his body twitching and flickering like a light bulb that wasn't screwed in all the way. Like he was there, but not there at the same time. He took a few seconds to look away from the man, toward the headstones at the far end of the street. When he looked back, the man was gone. Shoosted it away, unplugged from High Street. He was gone for sure, but Timothy could still see his outline, the same way a person's face stays etched in the darkness once a light is switched off, or the way he could remember faces on the inside of his eyes after they were closed, but only for a few moments before they faded, and he'd almost forgot who he was supposed to be remembering. It was like that with his own mother. He'd seen her only last week, but if he tried too hard to see her in his mind, she puffed away, just like the stranger. They'd only walked 3 houses away from his grandparents' house, but Timothy was spooked on the way home. At the opposite end of the street was a line of trees that marked the entryway to a forest he wasn't allowed to go into. Out there, a neighborhood kid had told him, old man Sam lived with his 3 retarded sons that stole kids and forced them to do dirty things that Timothy didn't understand but didn't want to happen. In the woods, a stream of glowing things, blinking eyes, unsaved souls, old man Sam's lantern, were enough to make him run, his heart wild. When he reached the stairs, he was no longer running, but floating. As he drew near the door, he saw, improbably, his own sleeping body on the davenport, his own hands curled together at his chest, the rack of pipes and a basket of pipe cleaners on the end table just above his pillow. The room seemed crowded with other people, but not people, not exactly, more like the thoughts of other people, his mother, father, school teachers, camp counselors. They were all laughing, some clutching each other's shoulders and swaying, their mouths opening in unison as if they were singing. But the only sound Timothy heard as he floated through the room was the sound of the oscillating fan as it ticked, ticked, ticked its way right, and then ticked, ticked, ticked its way back left. As he drifted back on top of himself, he was suddenly and amazingly homesick. He thought of his mother and father fighting in the kitchen, and of his father storming out the door and thrashing around in the garage. They were yelling about him, he knew, and no matter what he said, they wouldn't stop. He thought of his room, of the dinosaurs on the shelves, and the covered wagon nightlight, and the bookcase full of Lincoln Logs and Hot Wheels, and the fold-out record player, and his box of old 45s that sounded like they were recorded on the moon. He thought about the swing set and his father putting the parts of the set together and wondering why he had 2 extra bolts when everything seemed to fit together just fine, and singing Counting Flowers on the Wall while he tightened each bolt and adjusted the chains, and of the dartboard with his mother throwing one bullseye after another and his father grabbing her around the waist and kissing her neck. His brother Benjamin was there too, all of them together. We'll end part 1 there. Thanks. See you tomorrow.